April 30th, 1943. Off the southern coast of Spain, the sea was calm. Too calm. The tide rolled in gently beneath a sky washed in morning haze, and among the foam, something floated toward the fishermen of Huelva. At first glance, it looked like driftwood or a lost seal. Then they saw the uniform. A man in full Royal Navy attire, his body bloated from days in the water, washed gently against the nets. His wrist still bore a silver ID bracelet. A leather briefcase was chained to his belt. The fishermen, whispering to one another in Spanish, hauled him aboard and brought him ashore. They didn't know it yet. But they had just become part of one of the most brilliant deceptions in the history of war. While the corpse lay in the custody of local police, a coded message was already racing across British intelligence networks. Mincemeat swallowed whole, but to understand that message, and how a dead man could fool an empire, we have to go back to London, months earlier, where two men sat in a dim office plotting what Winston Churchill himself would later call a piece of pure, cold-blooded deception. It began with an idea and a body. The office was small and windowless. Buried deep within the Admiralty, Commander Ewan Montague, a lawyer turned intelligence officer, leaned over a cluttered table scattered with photographs, forged letters, and naval reports. Across from him sat Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of MI5, tall, eccentric, and fond of strange ideas. Between them lay a problem. The Allies were preparing to invade southern Europe. The question was where. The Germans expected an attack on Sicily, the most logical target, the soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill called it. To succeed, the Allies needed to convince Hitler that the invasion would land somewhere else. Greece, Sardinia, anywhere but Sicily. How? Cholmondeley asked. Do you make a man like Hitler believe a lie so big? Montague looked up from the map, his expression calm. You give him proof, he said. Written proof. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, an idea took shape. They would plant false documents, invasion plans, on a corpse. A body that appeared to be a British officer who had died in a plane crash at sea. The corpse would wash up on a Spanish shore, where German intelligence could find it and relay the information to Berlin. It was audacious, it was grotesque, and it might just work. The operation was given a name drawn from the darkest corners of British humor, Operation Mincemeat. But to make the deception believable, Montague and Cholmondeley needed one thing: a man who didn't exist. It took weeks to find him. Eventually, they received word from a coroner in London. A 34-year-old Welshman named Glyndwr Michael had died in a disused warehouse after ingesting rat poison. A lonely, forgotten man with no family, no connections, no story. In death, he had become the perfect spy. His body was delivered to the morgue at St. Pancras Hospital under total secrecy. There, Montague examined it with grim determination. The man had drowned before, in a sense. Fluid filled his lungs from the poison. That would match the story they were about to tell. Montague looked at the lifeless face and said quietly, "You're going to save lives, old chap." For weeks, the team built an entire life around the dead man. He was given a new name, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They crafted every detail: identity cards, theater tickets, a photograph of a fiancée named Pam, even love letters, carefully typed and then crumpled to look well worn. The chain attached to his briefcase carried official documents addressed to General Sir Archibald Nye, deputy to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. Inside the briefcase lay the heart of the deception. Letters between senior officers discussing Allied plans to invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The forgeries were so convincing that even close colleagues of the supposed correspondents might have believed them genuine. One letter read, "We have chosen Greece as the point of main assault. Sicily is being used merely as a diversion. Each comma, each signature, each watermark, perfect." When they were done, Montague looked over the dossier one last time. "If the Germans believe this," he said, "it will save thousands of lives." And then came the hardest part, giving Major Martin a death that would pass inspection. The body was placed in a steel canister filled with dry ice and labeled, "Handle with care. Optical instruments." It was then transported north under cover of night to the submarine HMS Seraph, commanded by Lieutenant Bill Jewell. Before they sealed the canister, Montague stood beside the corpse, now dressed in full uniform, complete with dog tags and a photograph of Pam tucked into his wallet. "Good luck, Major Martin," he murmured. "You've got one more mission." April 19th, 1943. HMS Seraph slipped quietly out of a Scottish harbor under strict orders. Deliver the body to the coast of Spain and release it near Huelva, a neutral port swarming with German agents. For days, the submarine cruised south through rough seas, its crew unaware of the mission's true purpose. When they reached the drop point, Jewell assembled his men on deck. "Gentlemen," he said, "what we're about to do must never be spoken of." The canister was unsealed, releasing a cloud of frost and a chill that sent shivers down the crew's spines. The body was carried to the rail, weighted with a life vest to ensure it would float just below the surface. As dawn approached, Jewell gave the order, "Let him go." The sea swallowed the figure gently, his cap drifting beside him, the briefcase chained securely to his waist. The tide carried him toward the Spanish coast, toward destiny. Montague's gamble had been set in motion. 3 days later, fishermen found the body. Spanish authorities, and by extension the Abwehr, German intelligence, were quickly informed. Within hours, the British attaché in Madrid received word of the discovery. His message back to London was brief but electric. Body recovered, local police informed, awaiting developments. Now, all Montague and his team could do was wait. Would the Germans take the bait, or would they see through the greatest lie of the war? The body of Major William Martin arrived at the Huelva morgue early on the morning of April 30th, 1943. Local police had reported a drowned British officer found offshore, and the Spanish authorities, eager to maintain diplomatic niceties with the Allies, notified the British consulate immediately. But what the Spaniards didn't know was that this was precisely what London had hoped for. The German Abwehr, the intelligence service operating throughout neutral Spain, already had deep ties in Huelva. Among their informants was a well-placed Spanish officer known to funnel every interesting scrap of Allied material to Berlin, and a dead British officer with a locked briefcase chained to his wrist was the kind of find that made reputations. By the time the body's effects reached the coroner's table, German intelligence was already whispering about it. Meanwhile, in London, Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley lived in a state of exquisite tension. Their deception, set adrift hundreds of miles away, was now entirely out of their hands. There were no radio signals to monitor, no agents to report back. The fate of Operation Mincemeat rested on the curiosity and thoroughness of the enemy. For the next several days, messages trickled in from the British naval attaché in Madrid. Spanish authorities refused to return the briefcase until permission from Madrid is granted. Body buried with full honors by the British vice consul. Local German agents showing great interest. Each line sent pulses of cautious hope through Montague's office. Then came the telegram that made his heart stop. Briefcase examined by Spanish authorities. Documents reportedly photographed. He read it twice, then passed it to Cholmondeley, who grinned and exhaled. "They've taken the bait." In Spain, the chain of deception moved with the elegance of a spy novel. The documents were secretly photographed by Spanish intelligence, who, as the British had counted on, passed them immediately to the Germans. Within hours, the film copies were on a courier plane bound for Berlin. There, in a dimly lit office inside the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, a group of German analysts gathered around the photographs. They pored over every page, every crease, every ink blot. The signatures were genuine, the tone unmistakably British. The inclusion of small personal details, a fiancé's letter, a note about cufflinks, reinforced the illusion of authenticity. The conclusion from the German side was swift and unanimous. The Allies were going to invade Greece. In London, Montagu paced his office, chain-smoking as the days turned into weeks. He knew the Germans wouldn't act immediately. Verification would take time. But every passing hour meant the deception might be spreading upward through the Reich's command chain, perhaps even to Hitler himself. Then, on May 14th, a decrypt arrived from Bletchley Park, the code-breaking center working tirelessly to intercept German communications. It carried a single line from a message transmitted between Berlin and the German embassy in Madrid. The Anglo-Saxon documents are considered genuine. Montagu didn't smile. He simply sat back and whispered, "My God, it worked." The ripple effect across German strategy was enormous. By mid-May, Hitler himself had become convinced that the Allies intended to strike Greece and the Balkans, not Sicily. His response was immediate and costly. Divisions were redeployed from Sicily to the Peloponnese and Sardinia. Luftwaffe squadrons were repositioned to Athens. German armored units that might have bloodied the Allied landings were now hundreds of miles away from where they were needed most. Operation Mincemeat had rewritten the map of Hitler's expectations. But even the best lies must be tied to truth. The British had thought of everything. In Huelva, Major William Martin was buried with full military honors. The British vice-consul arranged for a priest and a small ceremony. The coffin was draped in the Union Jack. Locals attended, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. No one suspected the man in the coffin had never lived. A few days later, a small notice appeared in the Times of London, a real obituary for a fake man. On active service, Major William Martin, Royal Marines, dearly beloved son of John Glyndor Martin, and the late Antonia Martin of Cardiff. That small paragraph cemented the deception. If the Germans checked, they would find proof that Major Martin had existed. A grieving family, an official record, a name among the honored dead. Even death had been fabricated with precision. Meanwhile, the corpse, the true identity of Glyndor Michael, lay beneath a headstone inscribed with his false name. Only decades later would the truth be revealed. But for now, his borrowed identity had served its purpose. The documents reached Berlin. The Führer read them personally. And Hitler, ever distrustful, yet convinced by the evidence, made a fatal decision. He reinforced Greece and Sardinia while leaving Sicily vulnerable, for the men preparing to land on the beaches of southern Italy. That decision meant the difference between survival and slaughter. Weeks later, on July 9, 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily began. American and British troops under General Eisenhower stormed ashore under cover of night. To the astonishment of commanders, German resistance was scattered and uncoordinated. The Luftwaffe barely appeared. Entire sectors of defense had been left unmanned. The deception had worked perfectly. In his after-action report, General Alexander summarized it with quiet understatement. Enemy reaction confirmed the success of our deception operations. Casualties lower than forecast. Strategic surprise achieved. Behind those dry words lay the victory of an idea, born not from force, but from imagination. In London, Ewan Montagu received the confirmation through an encrypted dispatch. Sicily had fallen in a matter of weeks. Tens of thousands of lives had been saved. He sat back in his chair, exhausted. The cigarette burned low between his fingers. "One dead man," he murmured, "and an entire army misled." Across the room, Cholmondeley chuckled softly. "Who would have thought a tramp in a briefcase could outwit the Reich?" Montague smiled faintly. "Sometimes," he said, "the truth needs a better disguise." When word reached Churchill, he was reportedly delighted. He read the report aloud to his aides, laughing. "You know," he said, "in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Operation Mincemeat was that bodyguard. A masterpiece of deception so elegant, so improbable, that it seemed almost fictional. Yet it was real. A dead man, a forged letter, and a lie so perfect it changed the course of the war. August 1943. The Mediterranean sun shimmered off the calm sea near Sicily, now in Allied hands. What had once been a fortress island bristling with German guns was now a staging ground for the next phase of the war. The march toward Rome. Across Europe, the Wehrmacht was still reeling. German reports revealed a staggering error in judgment. Entire divisions had been misplaced, fuel reserves wasted, command coordination shattered. And all because of a single drowned man. In London, inside the Admiralty's secret offices, Commander Ewan Montague stood before a map of Europe, covered in red pins marking Allied gains. He ran his finger down the coast of Italy and stopped at the boot's southern tip. He thought of Glyndwr Michael, the man who had died alone in a derelict warehouse, and of Major William Martin, the hero he had become. "It worked better than we could have hoped," Montague said quietly. His assistant, Lieutenant Cholmondeley, handed him a file, the post-mission summary of Operation Mincemeat. On its cover, stamped in red, were the words, "Most secret." Montague glanced through the final report. Enemy completely deceived. Operation confirmed success through ultra-decrypts. No indication of suspicion. He closed the file gently. "And yet," he murmured, "he'll never know what he did." A few weeks later, Montague was summoned to the cabinet war rooms. The corridors buzzed with restrained urgency. The war was far from over, but victories were beginning to stack. As Montague entered the small, smoke-filled conference room, Churchill's secretary greeted him with a curt nod. "The Prime Minister wishes to thank you personally," she said. Montague stiffened slightly. Churchill entered moments later, cigar in hand, eyes sharp even through the fog of exhaustion. "So you're the man who sent Hitler chasing ghosts in Greece," he said, grinning. Montague stood at attention. "It was a team effort, sir. Many men played a part." Churchill waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. Every masterpiece needs a conductor." He puffed his cigar and added, "I've always said the truth must have a bodyguard of lies." "Well done, Commander." Montague nodded once. "Thank you, Prime Minister." As Churchill turned to leave, he added one last remark over his shoulder. "Let's hope the next lie works just as well." While Britain celebrated in silence, Berlin descended into confusion. The Abwehr, Hitler's intelligence apparatus, had fallen under suspicion. Admiral Canaris, its head, was quietly accused of incompetence, even treason. Inside Hitler's Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a storm raged. The Führer slammed a hand on the conference table, scattering maps. "How," he demanded, "could we have been fooled by one corpse?" No one answered. His generals stood rigid, eyes down. The man who had championed the supposed invasion of Greece was nowhere to be seen. For months afterward, German forces would waste precious resources defending regions that no longer mattered. The deception had done more than trick Hitler's mind. It had eroded his faith in his own intelligence services. The rot within the Reich had begun to show. In Spain, the ripples of Operation Mincemeat lingered quietly. The body of Major William Martin remained buried in Huelva's San Marcos cemetery. The British vice consul visited occasionally, leaving flowers on the grave. The locals, not knowing the truth, treated it with reverence. To them, the dead officer was a symbol of Allied courage, a man who had perished in duty. Years later, when the truth would finally emerge, visitors would still come to that grave. And beneath the engraved stone, the man who had never existed continued to rest, a symbol of the war's strangest victory. Back in London, the secrecy around Operation Mincemeat was absolute. Officially, Major William Martin was a classified topic, a name never to be spoken outside intelligence circles. Montague returned to quieter duties. He resumed his work with naval intelligence, drafting reports, running agents, handling logistics. The war moved on to Normandy, to France, to the endgame. But the specter of mincemeat lingered with him, a reminder of how fragile truth could be in a world built on lies. One evening, long after the war, Montague walked along the Thames with his wife. The city had been rebuilt. Lights glimmered on the river, trams clattered over bridges. She asked him softly, "Do you ever think about it? That man?" Montague paused. "Every day." "Do you know his real name?" He shook his head. "Not then. Only later. Glyndwr Michael. A man who had nothing, who became the most important man in Europe. For a few weeks." She smiled sadly. "Then he wasn't nothing, was he?" Montague looked out across the water, the reflection of the city shimmering like liquid glass. "No," he said quietly. "He saved lives, more than he could ever have imagined." When the war finally ended in 1945, Operation Mincemeat remained hidden behind classified seals. The files sat untouched in the British archives for nearly a decade. But rumors persisted. In 1953, Montague himself published a carefully censored account, "The Man Who Never Was." It told the story in broad strokes, but kept many details secret. Hollywood soon came calling, turning the story into a film that thrilled audiences worldwide. Even then, few realized how close to disaster it had all come. If the tide in Spain had carried the body a few miles north or south, if the Spanish authorities had refused to cooperate, if a single German analyst had doubted the document's authenticity, the entire operation would have collapsed. The invasion of Sicily might have bled the Allies dry, and yet, by a strange combination of calculation and chance, everything had aligned. One body, one briefcase, one illusion. That changed the trajectory of a world war. Years later, in the quiet of retirement, Montague received a letter from Spain. It was from the British vice consul at Huelva, who still tended the grave. Inside was a photograph, the grave of Major William Martin, its headstone clean, a wreath of fresh flowers at its base. On the back, the vice consul had written, "He rests peacefully. The people here still remember him." Montague held the photo for a long time. Then he said softly, "Good. He deserves to." Today the grave still stands beneath the Andalusian sun. Tourists visit, historians linger, veterans pause. The inscription bears both names now. Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Glyndwr Michael, the man who never was. And in that paradox lies the strange poetry of war. That truth, when wielded with cunning, can be born from deception. Operation Mincemeat was not just a victory of spies over soldiers. It was a triumph of imagination, a reminder that wars are fought not only with guns and bombs, but with ideas, illusions, and the courage to make the unbelievable real. The man who never lived helped save those who did. And in the silent grave of Huelva, his story endures, a secret whispered across tides and time.